1974, a soldier walked out of a Philippine jungle in a full uniform he had kept clean for 29 years. He was still fighting World War II. Nobody had told him he could stop. His name was Hiroo Onoda. In December 1944, a young Japanese officer named Yoshimi Taniguchi gave him a simple order on Lubang Island in the Philippines. Do not surrender. Do not take your own life. Hold the island until we come back for you. Then the war moved on without him, and Onoda, a 22-year-old intelligence officer, would obey that order for the next 29 years. He was trained not as an ordinary soldier, but in a discipline most armies did not teach. Guerrilla warfare. Intelligence. The art of surviving behind enemy lines long after the front had collapsed. He was told something that would define the rest of his life. No matter what happens, we will come back for you. It may take 3 years. It may take 5. Whatever happens, we will come back. You have to understand what that instruction did to a mind like his. It did not just give him a mission. It gave him a filter. Every piece of information that reached him for the next 3 decades would be run through one question. Is this real? Or is this the enemy trying to make me quit? And once a mind adopts that filter, almost nothing can break it. Because everything that contradicts the mission gets reclassified as a trick. The war ended in August 1945. Onoda did not know that. Or rather, he knew it the way you know a rumor you have already decided to distrust. He was deep in the jungle with 3 other soldiers: Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private Kinshichi Kozuka, Private Yuchi Akatsu, 4 men, a few rifles, a fixed amount of ammunition, and a single unshakable belief. The war was still on. Leaflets came first. Dropped from planes scattered across the hills. The war is over. Come down. Onoda read them. He noticed a small error in the wording, a phrasing that did not sound like the imperial command he knew. And that was enough. To him it was not a mistake. It was proof. Proof that the leaflets were forgeries, printed by the Americans to lure the last holdouts into the open. The evidence that should have freed him became the evidence that trapped him deeper. Think about how that works. When you already believe something, the errors in the world do not correct you. They confirm you. A flaw in the message does not mean the message is false. It means the enemy is clumsy. Your certainty eats every contradiction and grows. Psychologists have a name for the shape of this: confirmation bias. The tendency to accept whatever fits what you already hold, and to explain away whatever does not. In most lives it costs you an argument, a grudge, a bad decision you defend too long. In Onoda's life it cost him 3 decades. The mechanism was the same, only the stakes were larger. So they kept fighting a war that no longer existed. They lived by a strict routine, moving camp with the seasons, sleeping in shifts, keeping their weapons dry through the long rains. They raided farms for rice and cattle. They exchanged fire with Filipino police and villagers who had no idea these were soldiers from a finished war. To the people of Lubang, Onoda and his men were not ghosts of history. They were a real and present danger. Over the years, the group was linked to the deaths of roughly 30 islanders. This is the part the legend tends to soften. The holdout was not a harmless hermit. He was a trained officer executing what he believed were combat operations against an enemy population, and real families on that island paid for his certainty. The seasons turned. The world outside changed in ways the 4 men could not imagine. Japan surrendered, rebuilt, and grew rich. Televisions appeared in homes that had been rubble. And in the hills of Lubang, none of it was allowed to be true. The group began to come apart. Akatsu was the first to break. The doubt got into him the way water gets into a boat, slowly, then all at once. In 1949, he walked away from the others. He survived alone in the jungle for months. In 1950, he surrendered. He simply came down out of the hills and gave himself up. To Onoda, this was not a man waking from a delusion. It was a defection, a weak link. And it hardened the remaining 3 even further, because now they had a story about what happened to men who lost their nerve. Then came the years of just holding on. Shimada was shot and killed in 1954 in a skirmish on a beach called Gontin. Now there were 2. Onoda and Kozuka alone in the green, keeping a war alive between the 2 of them like a fire they refused to let go out. Here is the question that should be sitting in your chest by now. How does a person hold a belief for that long against everything the world is screaming at him? The answer is not stupidity. Onoda was intelligent, disciplined, and observant. The answer is that a belief protected by the right rules becomes unfalsifiable. He had been told the enemy would use tricks. So every trick, shaped thing confirmed the enemy was near. He had been told to wait. So waiting became identity. To stop waiting was not to be corrected. It was to betray the man who gave him the order, the friends who had died beside him, and 20 years of his own life. You do this too. Not with a rifle in a jungle. But you do it. When you have invested enough of yourself into a belief, a relationship, a version of who you are, new information stops being information. It becomes a threat. And your mind, trying to protect you, does exactly what Onoda's did. It finds the flaw in the message and calls the whole message a lie. In October 1972, the fire finally cracked. Kozuka was killed in a shootout with a Filipino patrol while the two men were burning rice stores they saw as enemy supplies. He had held the war for 27 years, and he died in it. His death made headlines in Japan, because by then the idea that a soldier from the last war might still be alive in the hills was national news. The country had assumed the holdouts were long gone. Now there was proof that at least one remained. And now Onoda was the last one. One man. One rifle. One order that no living chain of command remembered giving. The world had actually been looking for him. Search parties had gone into those hills over the years. Family members had been flown in. Loudspeakers had played messages across the valleys. Newspapers were left along the trails. Photographs of his relatives had been placed in the jungle. His own brother had stood on Lubang and called out to him. Onoda heard some of it, and he filed all of it under the same heading: enemy deception. The voices could be imitations. The newspapers could be printed to fool him. The photographs could be fakes. The filter held against all of it. Then, in February 1974, something happened that the search parties never managed. A young Japanese man walked into the jungle alone. Not a soldier. Not a government official. A college dropout, an adventurer named Norio Suzuki, who had told friends he was going to find, in his words, Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. He set up camp, and he waited. Onoda found him. And for reasons even he struggled to explain later, he did not shoot. Maybe it was that Suzuki was alone. Maybe it was that he was not trying to convince Onoda of anything. He was just a young man, respectful, curious, treating the old soldier not as a problem to be solved but as a person. The two of them talked, they camped together, and in that conversation, Onoda said the thing that revealed the entire architecture of his prison. He would come out, but only on one condition, only if he received the order to stop from a superior officer. He would not accept the end of the war from a leaflet, or a loudspeaker, or a stranger. The same rule that had trapped him for 29 years now became the only key that could free him. Suzuki went back to Japan with proof. Photographs of the two of them together, and the Japanese government did something extraordinary. They found Yoshimi Taniguchi, the officer who had given the original order in 1944. He was an old man now, working in a bookshop. They flew him to Lubang. On the 9th of March 1974, Onoda came to a meeting point in his worn uniform, still carrying his rifle, his sword, his remaining ammunition, everything maintained across 3 decades of jungle. His weapon still worked. His boots were still repaired. He had kept a soldier's discipline for a soldier's war that had ended before it needed him. Taniguchi stood before him and read the order. The war was over. Onoda was relieved of duty. He was to lay down his arms. And Onoda, who had killed to keep this war alive, who had lost every friend to it, who had given it his entire youth, stood at attention and wept. Because for the first time in 29 years, the order fit the filter. It came from the right man, in the right form, through the right channel. His mind finally accepted what it had been rejecting since 1945. He had spent 29 years, 4 months, and a handful of days fighting for an empire that had ceased to exist before most of the people on that island were born. Now sit with what actually held him there. It was not the jungle. He could have walked out any year he chose. It was not a lack of information. The truth had been shouted at him from planes and loudspeakers and his own brother's mouth. What held him was a rule about which information he was allowed to believe. And that rule made him unreachable. You have rules like that? Everyone does? Beliefs you protect by deciding in advance which evidence counts and which evidence is a trick. The friend you have already decided is against you, so their kindness becomes manipulation. The version of yourself you cannot let go of, so every sign you have changed gets filed as a fluke. The story you tell about your own life that no fact is ever allowed to edit. Onoda's order came in the end. A man he trusted stood in front of him and told him the war was finished, and he was finally able to hear it. But most of us are not waiting on a jungle island for one specific officer. Most of us are holding our own private wars against people who stopped fighting long ago on the strength of an order nobody remembers giving. And the cruel part is the same for him as it is for you. The longer you hold the line, the more it costs to admit the line was never needed. Every year Onoda stayed made surrender more unbearable, because surrender now meant the previous years had been for nothing. That is the trap inside the trap. The more you have sacrificed for a belief, the harder your mind fights to keep it true. In 1974, a soldier walked out of a jungle he could have left at any time, still in the uniform of a country that no longer wanted the war he was fighting. He had kept his order perfectly for 29 years, while everyone else knew it was already over. The only question that matters is the one he never got to ask himself in time. Which war are you still fighting? And who exactly are you still waiting for permission to end it?